Hey there, if you're a fan of Deep Purple or kind of that classic rock period that they were in, I found this really cool article I think you will enjoy. I'm actually, I was a pretty, I don't know, I was a fan of Deep Purple. I'm more a fan of the family tree of Deep Purple. You know, all the things that came out of it, because you can tie so many things back to them and what grew out of that band, you know, from the Rainbow going off and all the things that came off of Rainbow, and then Whitesnake coming off it, all the things that came off that, and then all the different people that were involved with that period of time and all the different directions they went over the years. Just fascinating stuff. And so anyway, this article was written, this is February 8th of 1975, and Deep Purple was well into their career and success at this point. You can see here at the beginning of this article, there's a picture of Ritchie Blackmore, who of course is, you know, the guitarist for Deep Purple, founding member. And then he's the one that went off later and started the band Rainbow. And then Rainbow, of course, had like Ronnie James Dio was the first singer for Rainbow. And then Ronnie James Dio went off and did all the stuff that he did. And then anyway, fun stuff. But this is a cool little article. It's not very long, but I just wanted to share this with you because I found this, I read it, I thought it was kind of interesting, and I thought if you were into this kind of stuff, you would enjoy this too. It's fun to go back and read these things that were being said at the time. You know, now that we have the hindsight, you know, near here we are, what, 40, 50, I don't know, 40 some odd years later, 50 years later, we get to hear what was being said at the time. So here we go, written by Cameron Crowe. Jacksonville, Florida. Ritchie Blackmore's face fell into a tortured grimace. "This tastes like burnt rubber," he growled through a mouthful of steak. Fuming, he sank a fork into the meat and flung it across the dining room of the high-rent restaurant. The maitre d' hustled up to the Deep Purple guitarist. "Is something wrong with your steak, sir?" Hey, hold on for just a second. We'll get right back to the video. But if you like this stuff, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, leave any comments. We'd love to hear from you, and we really, really appreciate it. Anyway, with that, back to the video. Blackmore looked down at his now meatless plate. "What steak?" "The steak you've just thrown across the room." "Oh, yes, of course." Blackmore smiled innocently. "The steak was fine. It's the baked potato that's a bit, well, overcooked." Later that evening, tuning his guitar backstage at the Jacksonville Coliseum, Blackmore explained himself. "I love this business," he said. "I can do exactly what I want with who I want. I don't have to be nice to anyone. I don't like people anyway." It's funny hearing that, because when you hear stories about Ritchie Blackmore, you kind of get that feeling about his personality. He's kind of a little bit standoffish, and anyway, that's kind of how he's come across over the years. The guiding hand behind Deep Purple, Ritchie Blackmore, 29, can count among his peers English guitarists Jimmy Page, Jeff Beck, Peter Green, and Eric Clapton. And I mean, talk about legends. You know, I mean, Jimmy Page, obviously, Led Zeppelin. Jeff Beck, who had, I think he was part of the Yardbirds, but he really was famous as a solo artist. And he was amazing. Jeff Beck, even until in recent years, he was putting out great stuff. Peter Green, of course, is Fleetwood Mac. Eric Clapton, been with Cream, and all these guys were just legends. So, continuing, Blackmore began his professional career at 17 as lead guitarist and arranger for Screaming Lord Sutch. After quitting Sutch's band, Blackmore took a look around at the budding British pop scene and fled in horror, moving to Hamburg, Germany for a few years. "I practiced 5 hours a day. Finally, Jimi Hendrix hit it big in England. I figured it was safe again, so I moved back and got together a band, Deep Purple, of my own." Blackmore has spent most of his career outside the spotlight, content to call the shots from the dark side of, getting back to the top of the stage. "I haven't taken steps toward becoming a guitar star simply because I don't fit the mold. That's best left to people like Led Zeppelin's Jimmy Page, who look the part. I always get embarrassed when I start flaunting myself. That's kind of a funny statement. By the way, Ritchie Blackmore, I don't know that he was any sort of a like whiz as far as guitar players go, a guitar star, but he was a guitar star. I mean, he definitely had a distinctive sound. I mean, when you listen to his playing, it's kind of unmistakable. He has just this very distinct way of playing. And when he says he doesn't like to when I start flaunting myself, I mean, the guy you go watch some of that old stuff, and he was definitely a showman. So he definitely flaunted himself, but whatever. I don't know for sure what he means by that. And while he groaned over sizable alimony and child support payments covering 2 ex-wives, I can't resist temptation, it puts in parentheses, and a son, Blackmore is still raking it in. Deep Purple's relentless power riffing has held a massive international following ever since their first 1968 hit, Hush, which is actually a really cool song. And that's an interesting song to talk about because that was the early Deep Purple. And that was before even Ian Gillan, who kind of is known as kind of Deep Purple's voice, at least through the really, really, Smoke on the Water days, Child in Time days. But anyway, this was actually a song that was put out before Ian Gillan even joined the band. But that was a big hit. Hush, 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 I heard it calling my name now. Hush, hush. You've heard that song before. In America, where the band soared to supergroup status 2 years ago with the success of Smoke on the Water, like I just mentioned, and everybody talk about the one of the most well-known riffs of all time. Bam, 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 ba-da. Everybody knows that tune. Matter of fact, when you learn how to play the guitar, that's one of the first riffs you ever learn just because it is such a classic. Their newest album, Stormbringer, is already a gold addition to their 7 LP catalog. According to a Warner Brothers spokesman, no one, not even Elton John, the Allman Brothers, and or Led Zeppelin, sells more records worldwide. Blackmore takes issue with the term heavy metal. Nothing's worse than hearing someone say Deep Purple. Oh, wait, sorry, I want to read that again. This is a quote. Nothing's worse than hearing someone say Deep Purple? Wow, man, they're just like Black Sabbath, knocking out all the riffs. If people can't comprehend the subtleties that we put into the music, then I haven't the patience to explain them. I have no tolerance for fools. Nobody tells me what to do. So there's Ritchie Blackmore basically rejecting this idea that Deep Purple is anything like Black Sabbath from a riff standpoint. Now, that may be true in general, but I mean, with their biggest hit, Smoke on the Water, that is so riffy. I mean, that riff could have easily been on Paranoid, Black Sabbath's second album. So it was realistic for people to make that comparison, even though Ritchie Blackmore didn't like it. There was some truth to that. Let's see here. Case in point, last April's California Jam, Purple, lured by the Superbucks headliner fee, signed up for the ABC bankrolled festival, taped for television. The band's only contractual, going back to the top, demand was that they be the first band to go on after sunset. And I think there's some video online of this because at that point, David Coverdale's singing, Glenn Hughes, I think, is on bass. Anyway, but the Jam ran an hour and a half ahead of schedule, and when it came to the group's position in the show, the sun was shining bright. The show's producer, I won't name him, came into my dressing room and demanded that we go on immediately. I had just gotten there. I just ignored him. The guy kept standing there and said we'd be off the show if I wasn't on stage by the time he counted to 30. I sat there, tuned my guitar, and listened to him count out loud. He hadn't reached 15 when I had him thrown out. Listen, we get the brunt of a lot of disrespect. People get upset because we're making so much money. The tax people have gone berserk over us. They're really trying to skin us. We've all moved out of England to California. If Ritchie Blackmore gets defensive, sometimes violently so, over those who run down his band, it could be because he wants to do the honors himself. Selling the amounts of records that we do is no big deal, he said. I guess it's nice to know you're being appreciated, but to me, Deep Purple is best on stage. On record, we're pretty average, and that includes myself. Sometimes I cringe when I hear our records. That's fascinating to hear somebody have him make that comment. Actually, the recordings that they did, I don't know. I thought their studio work, in my opinion, was really good. I mean, one of these songs that came out of this period was the song "Burn," and I think that's kind of a masterpiece in the studio. I think it's great. I mean, the stuff John Lord did on the keyboard, on the organ, the Ritchie Blackmore stuff, Ian Pace, his drums were great. I don't know. And of course, Gilmour's voice. Those are the early days when we were just learning not David Gilmour, David Coverdale, sorry, who went on later to form Whitesnake. This was in those early days with him, and he was just amazing. Let's see, we hardly ever rehearse together except for a tour. We're all very lazy, but professional enough to churn the songs out just in time. Deep Purple isn't too dedicated a band. I think we'd all rather sleep. 2 nights before, on and off night, Blackmore had given up some of that sleep to complete a long-promised solo project, a single at a Tampa studio. His backup included Ronnie Dio and Gary Driscoll, the vocalist and drummer, respectively, of Elf, and cellist Hugh McDowell of ELO. So anyway, I think that's the end of the article, right? Yeah. So I think that's so interesting, again, and right there he's talking about that, because I think I mentioned that a second ago, because what did he do after he left Deep Purple? He took off from Deep Purple. So David Coverdale stayed in Deep Purple. Ritchie Blackmore left. Tommy Bolin, I think he was the one that came in and replaced Ritchie Blackmore as the guitarist, and then Deep Purple carried on for a little bit, and then that's when finally David Coverdale left Deep Purple and then went and started Whitesnake, and then Whitesnake ended up becoming obviously a huge mega band back in the 1980s. I loved them. I thought they were just amazing. I loved that the early Whitesnake stuff too was so good. And then of course Ritchie Blackmore went out and formed Rainbow, and this must have been the early stuff that was happening with that, because he was doing it with Ronnie James Dio, who had been with the band Elf. They put out that album that had Man on the Silver Mountain. And then Rainbow went on, and they had a bunch of hits. So they had, of course, that's time with Ronnie James Dio. And then Graham Bonnet came in as a singer for a couple albums. And then Joe Lynn Turner came in. And anyway, this is what I mean about the family tree of Deep Purple. It just went so many different directions, because then you can follow Graham Bonnet when he left there, and then he went and he was with, he went and sang for Alcatraz, and then who else was in Alcatraz? Yngwie Malmsteen and Steve Vai, and then Steve Vai later goes and connects up with David Coverdale in the later years of Whitesnake, who had been in Deep Purple. You see how it did all these different pieces, and then Ronnie James Dio, after he left Rainbow, went and sang for Black Sabbath, and then who also went and sang for Black Sabbath? Ian Gillan did, who had been with Deep Purple as the singer. So they just kind of twisted in on itself over and over again, all these different players, and I loved all that, the connections that they did here. But it is interesting just to kind of see this little snapshot in time. This is after Deep Purple had already become a monster band. And here they were in 1975, and they're just catching Ritchie Blackmore in just kind of some personal moments. You see him at a restaurant, you see him kind of talking openly about what their lives were like. And this is after he's a superstar. And the bands are moving and everything's really clipping and they're making tons of money. And I kind of liked David. I liked all these guys, but I loved Ritchie Blackmore. he was cool. I was a fan of his back when I was a young guy and I was learning how to play the guitar. And he just had that real unique, just had a very, very unique sound. And he was a good songwriter and just kind of a cool, just kind of had a cool image. And I think a lot of us just gravitated to him just because he was kind of cool. And then I didn't really discover him. I was too young for the for the Deep Purple days. I didn't discover that until later. But I did show up just in time for a little bit of that Rainbow stuff, especially the Joe Lynn Turner stuff. And then, of course, you go back later and you start discovering all the early days things, because I got into Dio long before I got into Rainbow. And, of course, Dio put out Holy Diver. That's about the time I really started noticing things about that age. And I had then made the connection between Ronnie James Dio and Black Sabbath because they had the song Mob Rules on the soundtrack of the movie Heavy Metal. And that's the first time I'd become introduced to Black Sabbath was with the Dio days. Then you rewind that further and then you go, oh, Ozzy. Because I knew Ozzy as a solo artist. I didn't even realize he was singing for, again, I'm a kid. Right? And I'm just being introduced to these things. You realize that all these guys had this rich history before you discovered them in 1982. So anyway, I thought you'd get a kick out of that. Hey, as usual, please like the videos, subscribe to the channel, leave any comments. If there's other things you'd like us to look up, old concert reviews, old record reviews, and things like this, we'd love to do the research and make videos about it. Anyway, of course, with that, as always, have a fantastic day.